The Owl's roster massively struggles with its general size and the fact that a good chunk of creatures aren't much more than a differently sized version of a creature that was already planned for the game, as well as evidently being a balancing and realism nightmare without intensive care and thought, even in the Legacy version where there was a lot less creatures to balance. I wasn't around when Pet the Titan's initial roster was announced, but if I was, I knew I would have been ecstatic about it. It did stick to only 10 dinosaurs, but those dinosaurs were all different to each other and fit neatly into two chosen formations, possibly expanding in the future. For carnivores, the lumbering, fish-eating Suchomimus, the brutish, bone-crushing Daspletosaurus, the more agile, bleed-hunting Allosaurus, the presumably scavenger-based brawling Ceratosaurus, and the small peck-hunting Latin Venatrix. For herbivores, the tanky, blunt-damaging Lambeosaurus, the glass cannon Stegosaurus, the aggressive, forward-defending Styracosaurus, the raw-speed runaway Struthiomimus, and the agility-based runaway Cantosaurus. It could be said that a disabler herbivore like Pachycephalosaurus or Ankylosaurus would have been better in the place of one of their runaways, but as a small roster, it definitely covers a lot and doesn't test the limits of an ecosystem. Despite being dozens of millions of years apart, you don't have to question how any of these matchups go. You don't have to question if any of them need some sort of tailoring in their design or size. Everything is clear and everything is realistic. There is no Tenontosaurus that's 2 times bigger than it should be. There is no Albertosaurus that causes questions about its fight against Allosaurus, as opposed to the larger Daspletosaurus, of which it's obvious from the get-go who will win that fight. 10 dinosaurs, good coverage, no confusion, and of course, no apexes. Of course, there is an apex predator, it's Despleto, but I'm more referring to the over half a dozen ton behemoths that infest the other games and their balance, and appeal to the popular dinosaur required or game will fail mindset. One of the best parts about POT's roster was that you still had some popular dinosaurs like your Allosaurus and Stegosaurus, but it also made sure to include dinosaurs similar enough to the other popular ones. Daspletosaurus is your T-Rex. Hell, it's close enough to Rex that people in global chat were literally referring to it as such before the actual Rex released. Suchomimus is your Spino, Lambeosaurus is your Parasaurolophus. The game didn't lack any dinosaurs that would attract the general audience, because one look at a picture of Daspletosaurus and your average person that isn't too interested in dinosaurs is gonna go, yo, they have a T-Rex. And then it was time for the Indiegogo, where Pandora's box opened. There were two main ways that extra dinosaurs were added: stretch goals and dinos bought by backers. Yeah, you can see where this is going. The stretch goal creatures weren't too bad and didn't test the size range previously established. They introduced a good few new types of creatures, as well as a marine and aerial portion of the roster. The Ankylosaur of Anodontosaurus, another creature many just refer to as its most popular counterpart in-game, the sauropod of Amargasaurus, the venom-based predator Megalania, the gharial-like Sarcosuchus, the tree-climbing Microraptor, marine apex Tylosaurus, fishing pterosaur Thalassodromius, marine tangled Sichthes, flying insectivore Rhamphorhynchus, sprinting Abelosaurid Pycnonemosaurus, quick-swimming Uranosaurus, flying apex Hatzegopteryx, ankle-breaking Pachycephalosaurus, and long-necked Kaiwakia. 14 extra creatures that were all reached in crowdfunding, 7 of which being land-based or able to interact with the land. While it did definitely intrude a bit on the sense of ecosystem and realism with creatures that were in completely different eras of time, or in completely different continents to most of the original 10, it was definitely worth it to increase the numbers, which many would consider lackluster, and add some of the much needed playstyles that were missing from the OG 10, mainly the 2 ambushers and the 2 disablers that were added, though unfortunately Packy didn't end up getting a bone break for some reason, so only 1 disabled there. So now with 24 creatures and essentially 2 new realms of play, covering pretty much any playstyle you could ask for, we should be done, right? That's all. We're finished. Everything is perfect.
何をしてる？立てよ、父さん。忘れたのか？何をしにここに来たのか。犬に食われた妹に報いるためだろう。
While crowdfunded playable editions have worked in the past, even within the genre, they were in specific cases. With Saurian, they only had 4 playables planned, and the playable editions were a community-wide vote between creatures that only fit into the formation the game was based around. With Beast of Bermuda, you had to pitch your playable edition to the devs themselves, so that they could oversee your idea and the dinosaur you have an idea for, in order to decide whether or not it'd be right for the game. Panther Titans didn't seem to talk with people about their additions at all, nor did they impose any restrictions past the few perk rewards still readable on the Indiegogo about a specific type of dinosaur. Zero precautions whatsoever. A Kilobeta, Alioramus, Concavenator, Deinonychus, Metriacanthosaurus, Albertoceratops, Iguanodon, Kentrosaurus, and Miragaia. But something more sinister was brewing. You see, someone that bought one of these perks wanted another Ceratopsian, a larger one, bringing in Eotriceratops, which is basically just normal Triceratops. From what I've heard, to counteract such a large addition, the person who initially wanted Neovenator changed their mind to T-Rex instead to fight Eotrike. Yeah. A whole new size tier was added to the game because they let people with too much money to spend pick basically anything they wanted. This also included the Deinonychus and Barsboldia purchases. If this wasn't enough, near the end of the Kickstarter's run, the devs themselves decided to throw in Spinosaurus as well. Why? Just because. Lol. So that's an extra 14 creatures, all terrestrial pretty much, dragging apexes into the roster, and none of these new additions really adding much as far as playstyle goes. The devs specifically crafted a realistic roster based around specific prehistoric ecosystems, instead of just going with the ones they liked as the other games did, just to allow for people backing their game to insert dinosaurs based on liking them. You see the problem there? And some may ask, hey, what's so bad about apexes? Well, while I must admit I'm just sick of seeing the same creatures or apexes in general in these games, evidently they've been a balancing nightmare in all these games, including POT. Backers brought in a whole new size tier and set of problems with it. Upon release, they are always either too strong or too weak, then buff/nerf to the point where the opposite is true, and on creatures that are large and influential over what's around them, it is a lot more noticeable to have balance problems. With many creatures you also might as well just play their bigger counterpart now, which is kind of sad. Whilst POT has a poor system of balance in general, there are creatures in the past and also currently that fit in neatly as far as balancing goes, where they didn't feel too strong or too weak, or like they could completely reign over multiple playables. Metriacanthosaurus has seen its ridiculous balance stages, but from what I understand it's currently fine, same with Styraco and some others. Whilst I haven't always kept up with the balance, I don't think there's been a singular stage so far when an apex has seemed just fine in terms of their actual strength. For example, when Rex released, a defense Spino could just face tank it to death, or when Barsboldia released and could just completely destroy everything including multiple Eotrikes at once. Nowadays with Rex, it is not only the highest or maybe second highest DPS in the entire game, but is also just as tanky as its Ceratopsian rival. Its health is being changed soon, but that won't really make a difference, especially when it comes to the actual matchup of Eo versus Rex, since it is also getting a HP nerf. A needed change for sure, but I don't think it's going to matter all that much in the end. It isn't that apexes are impossible to balance, but they're more trouble than it's worth a lot of the time, and POT has not done a very good job with them so far. Even if there's some slight improvements, it doesn't really justify their addition to the game, what they did to the roster, and what they did to the creatures they essentially invalidated. And the reason it's more trouble than it's worth is also partly due to the fact that everybody wants to play the biggest thing, so every single mistake they make with the balance of them is a lot more impactful on how the game is played overall. It's why whenever you go to hotspots, it's usually at least 70% apex creatures, and the rest of it is small things running around doing quests or sitting around to get Care Beared. And I know that some people are going to say, well, who cares, the more the better, but that just completely misses the point of anything discussed here, and while I understand that your average person probably doesn't care much and just likes having a lot of dinosaurs, even if many of them don't bring anything to the table, it's still costing the game not only in gameplay but also in development time, because if it weren't for those 14 extra bought dinos, the roster would have been long completed by now and all added to the game, likely including the aquatics and flyers, and it's very safe to assume that anticipated abilities like the Pounce would have been in by now too. And I know that it doesn't matter now because they've already long since added most of these dinos and the people who paid for them did so years ago, but sometimes it's just nice to think about what could have been, and to remind people not to make the same mistakes. You never want to repeat history after all. If I could make any suggestion to the developers, because I don't think this is a thing at the moment, allow for servers to turn off any base game playables they don't want. I know I'm not alone in this because I've spoken to people about this before, and I know a good chunk of people would love to play on servers that only have the original roster, or maybe the originals plus the stretch goal ones, or maybe some servers just don't want specific creatures like Megalania for the realism aspect. I just think it would be healthier for the game overall to have those features. That's about it. See ya.